The rhythmic scream of the hydraulic press didn't stop when the emergency button was slammed. It only deepened into a wet, bone-crunching thud that silenced the entire factory floor. Maria stood frozen as a pool of bright crimson snaked across the oil-stained concrete, inching toward her boots while the red strobe of the alarm painted the walls in rhythmic flashes of blood. Through the hissing steam and the panicked shouts of the workers, she looked up to see her mentor standing by the control console, his face a calm, motionless mask that didn't match the horror of the wreckage. By midnight, the factory was a tomb of cold iron. But the logs on Maria's glowing monitor told a story the police hadn't seen. The safety sensors hadn't glitched. They had been surgically erased from the system just minutes before the strike. As a heavy bolt slid into place, locking her inside the pitch-black warehouse, the distant grind of a machine starting up echoed through the rafters. Someone wasn't just trying to cover up an accident. They were recalibrating the entire plant to ensure she was the next piece of scrap metal. The heavy steel door yielded with a groan that Maria Jensen felt in her very marrow, a shuddering vibration of metal against metal that signaled the start of another 12-hour descent. As she stepped onto the gantry, the air of the Motor City Parts plant hit her like a physical blow. A thick, sweltering miasma of vaporized coolant, scorched lubricant, and the metallic tang of iron filings. It was a scent that had lived in her pores for 20 years, a second skin she could never quite scrub away, no matter how hard she pressed the loofah in her cramped shower at home. Below, the factory floor stretched out like the digestive tract of some subterranean leviathan. Hundreds of machines shrieked and hammered in a dissonant symphony that made her skull pulse with a rhythmic, stabbing pain. Maria adjusted the strap of her tool belt, her fingers brushing the frayed thread of the colorful string bracelet her daughter had tied around her wrist 3 years ago. It was a fragile thing, faded by sweat and grime. But it was the only anchor she had in this sea of gray concrete and rusted iron. She gripped her lukewarm mug of gas station coffee, the plastic lid cracked, and stared down at the assembly lines. Her eyes, sunken and shadowed from a night spent pacing the floor with a teething infant, tracked the movement of the robotic arms. Everything looked sluggish. The rhythm was off. She could hear it, a subtle hitch in the heartbeat of line 3, a mechanical hesitation that spelled disaster for a supervisor already walking the razor's edge of a performance review. "Rough night, Jensen?" The voice was gravel and warmth. Maria didn't need to turn to know Frank was standing there. She could smell the familiar cloud of tobacco and peppermint that followed him like a loyal dog. Frank Walker, the man who had taught her how to calibrate a micrometer when she was still a green girl shivering in the winter drafts of the old warehouse. "Teething," Maria muttered, her voice a dry rasp. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, her thumb catching on a jagged, unclipped nail. She didn't sleep until 4. "I feel like I'm walking through wet cement." Frank let out a low, sympathetic chuckle and leaned against the safety railing, his large, calloused hand resting near hers. "The kid'll grow out of it. The plant, though? This place just gets crankier with age. Look at line 4. The hydraulic pressure is spiking again. Carter is breathing down my neck about the quotas, Maria. If we don't hit the numbers on this government contract, the suits in the glass towers are going to start looking for heads to roll." Maria looked at the pressure gauges on the distant monitors. Frank was right. The needles were dancing in the amber zones. "I'll recalibrate the sensors during the shift change," she said, her teeth gritted. "We aren't losing this line, not today." "That's my girl," Frank said, patting her shoulder. It was a gesture of mentorship, a fatherly touch that usually offered comfort. But today, for some reason she couldn't name, it made the skin on her neck prickle. She descended the stairs to the floor. the heat intensifying with every step. The transition from the gantry to the heart of the workshop was a plunge into chaos. She moved through the maze of stamping presses and CNC lathes, her limp, a souvenir from a herniated disc she refused to acknowledge, more pronounced on the hard concrete. "Jim, watch that feed rate," she shouted over the roar of a pneumatic drill. James "Jim" Harris, a boy who looked too young to be handling heavy machinery, jumped. His thin fingers trembled as he adjusted the dials. He looked at Maria with wide, panicked eyes, his hand straying to the scar on his cheek. "It's sticking, Maria. The lubricant isn't reaching the primary bearing. I told maintenance, but they said—" "I don't care what they said," Maria snapped, her fatigue manifesting as a sharp, jagged edge in her tone. "If that bearing seizes, the whole assembly collapses. Get the manual override. Now." She pushed past him, her mind a blur of production norms and safety protocols. She felt like a juggler holding a dozen spinning plates, each one made of lead. The air grew heavier, the humidity of the Detroit morning bleeding through the high, cracked windows of the factory. Then, the world broke. It started with a sound, not a bang, but a high-pitched, metallic scream, the sound of a machine protesting its own existence. Maria spun around just as the primary hydraulic press on line 3 shuddered. The safety lights began to strobe a frantic, sickly red. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice tearing in her throat, but it was too late. The automated arm, designed to move with surgical precision, suffered a violent spasm. It swung wide, a blind, stupid giant of steel. Jim was in its path. The heavy press came down, not on a steel housing, but on human bone and sinew. The sound of the impact was sickeningly wet, muffled by the sudden hiss of escaping steam. Then came the scream. It was a high, thin sound that cut through the factory's roar like a razor through silk. "Shut it down! Kill the power!" Maria bellowed, diving toward the emergency stop. She slammed her palm against the red button. The line groaned to a halt, the sudden silence more terrifying than the noise. Jim was on the floor, his arm a mangled ruin of red and gray, pinned beneath the cooling block. Blood began to pool on the oil-stained concrete, a bright, horrific crimson that looked alien in this world of monochrome machinery. "Oh God, oh God," someone was sobbing. Maria was on her knees in the blood, her hands shaking as she tried to find a pulse, a way to lift the weight. "Call an ambulance. Someone get a tourniquet." Through the gathering crowd, she saw Frank. He was standing by the control console, his face a mask of shock, but his hands were steady. He wasn't moving toward the boy. He was looking at the monitor. Before the paramedics even arrived, the vultures were circling. Robert Carter, the plant manager, appeared like a ghost in a cheap, ill-fitting suit. His face was a bloated mask of fury, the sweat beads on his balding head catching the red strobe of the emergency lights. "What happened here, Jensen?" Carter roared, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and rage. "You were the supervisor on deck. You signed off on the safety logs this morning." "The sensors failed, Robert," Maria said, her voice trembling as she looked up from Jim's unconscious form. Her hands were stained to the wrists. "The override didn't kick in. We reported the sticking bearing." "I don't see a report." Carter spat, stepping over a puddle of hydraulic fluid. "I see a ruined line and a lawsuit. You're suspended, Maria. Effective immediately. Don't you dare touch those logs. Security will escort you out." Maria stood, her legs feeling like water. She looked to Frank for support, for the man who had always been her shield. Frank looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry, Maria," he murmured, his voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind, whistling through the broken windows. But the numbers don't lie. You were in charge. The walk to the exit was a blur of accusing stares and the cold, clinical arrival of the EMTs. As the heavy steel doors shut behind her, the silence of the Detroit morning felt like a shroud. She stood in the parking lot, the sun beginning to burn through the smog, and looked at her blood-stained hands. The accident wasn't a failure of maintenance. She knew the rhythm of those machines. She knew their quirks. That press hadn't seized. It had been commanded to strike. The sun had long since dipped below the jagged horizon of the Detroit skyline, leaving the city in a bruised purple twilight that offered no comfort. Maria sat in her rusted sedan, the engine ticking as it cooled, her eyes fixed on the perimeter fence of Motor City Parts. The suspension felt like a slow-motion execution. If she didn't find out why that press had failed, she wouldn't just lose her job. She'd lose everything. The debt collectors were already calling about the mortgage, and the thought of Lisa, her daughter, losing the only roof she'd ever known, made Maria's stomach twist into a hard, cold knot. She checked her watch. 11:45 p.m. The shift change was over, and the skeleton crew would be concentrated in the shipping bays on the far side of the complex. She stepped out of the car, the wind off the river biting through her thin work jacket. The parking lot was a graveyard of cracked asphalt and weeds. She moved with a practiced stealth, sticking to the deep shadows cast by the rows of rusted shipping containers. Her breath came in short, sharp plumes of white. The fence was a joke. A section near the old transformer had been pulled back years ago by copper thieves and never properly repaired. Maria squeezed through, the jagged wire catching on her sleeve, drawing a thin line of heat across her forearm. She didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. The factory loomed over her, a dark cathedral of industry. She reached the side entrance, the heavy metal door cold beneath her palm. She knew the trick to this one. You had to lift the handle while kicking the base. It popped open with a dull thud that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Inside, the smell was different at night. The heat had dissipated, replaced by the scent of cold iron and stagnant water. The machines looked like sleeping beasts, their sharp angles softened by the gloom. Maria moved toward the master station, her footsteps echoing on the concrete. She reached the glass-walled office of the floor supervisor, her office, or what used to be. The blue light of the terminal screen cast a ghostly pallor over the room as she bypassed the login. She'd set the admin password months ago. Lisa 2015. Her fingers flew across the keys, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled up the system logs from the hour before the accident. Come on, she whispered, the clicking of the keys the only sound in the cavernous space. There it was, a manual override. At 7:02 a.m., exactly 60 minutes before Jim's arm was crushed, the thermal sensors on line 3 had been deactivated. Not by a glitch, not by a mechanical failure. It was a command entered from a remote terminal using a high-level clearance code. Her blood turned to ice. That code didn't belong to her. It didn't even belong to Carter. A sudden, sharp clack echoed through the darkness. Maria froze, her fingers hovering over the print command. The sound had come from the direction of the locker rooms. It was the sound of a metal door being slammed shut. She didn't wait to see who it was. She killed the monitor and ducked under the desk, her heart racing so fast she feared it would burst. Through the glass partition, she saw a flicker of a flashlight beam dancing across the assembly line. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate. They weren't the hurried steps of an intruder. They were the confident strides of someone who owned the place. Maria waited until the light moved toward the far end of the shop floor. She slipped out of the office, her body pressed against the cold metal of the stamping machines. She needed to get to the locker rooms. She needed to know who was here. She moved through the darkness, navigating by touch and memory. She reached the row of dented green lockers, the air here thick with the smell of stale sweat and cheap deodorant. One locker was hanging open, its contents spilled onto the floor. Frank's locker. Maria's breath hitched. She knelt, her fingers brushing against a thick, expensive-looking envelope. She picked it up, the paper stiff and cold. Inside were sheets of blueprints, not for parts, but for the factory itself. Red ink marks slashed across the schematics, circling the main gas lines and the primary electrical transformers. And then, the letters. Correspondence from Apex Industrial, a rival firm that had been trying to buy the land for years. They didn't want the factory. They wanted the ground it sat on for a new logistics hub. Frank, she breathed, the name a curse. The debt receipts fell from the envelope. Thousands of dollars in gambling debts, signed with Frank's sloping, familiar hand. He wasn't just a mentor. He was a man being eaten alive by his own failures. A floorboard creaked directly behind her. Maria didn't turn. She didn't need to. The scent of tobacco and peppermint, now sour and suffocating, filled her lungs. "You always were too curious for your own good, Maria," Frank murmured. His voice was no longer the warm gravel she remembered. It was as cold as the steel surrounding them. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling but her gaze fixed on the lockers. "You sabotaged the line. You hurt Jim just to give them an excuse to shut us down." "I did what I had to do to survive," Frank said, stepping closer. The heat of him radiated against her back. "This place is a corpse, Maria. We're just the maggots eating what's left. Apex offered me a way out, a way to clear the slate. By burning it down?" She finally turned. The blueprints clutched to her chest like a shield. Frank was holding a heavy industrial wrench. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a tired old man who had run out of choices. "The insurance will cover the workers. They'll get a payout. It's better than waiting for the bank to lock the doors and leave everyone with nothing." "You crippled a boy, Frank." "A mistake," he snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate anger. The timing was off. He wasn't supposed to be there. He took a step toward her, the wrench swinging slightly at his side. "Give me the papers, Maria. Walk away. I can make sure your mortgage is taken care of. I can make sure Lisa has everything she needs." "I don't want your blood money," she spat. The lights in the locker room suddenly flickered and died. "Then you're just in the way," Frank said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. Maria didn't wait for the blow. She dived past him, her boots skidding on the linoleum. She burst out into the main shop floor, the darkness swallowing her. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of Frank's boots. "You can't run, Maria. I know every inch of this place." She scrambled toward the back of the warehouse, her mind racing. She couldn't go back to the main exit. He'd catch her before she reached the fence. She looked up and saw the faint, ghostly glow of the moon through the high ventilation ducts. She began to climb. She hauled herself onto a stack of wooden pallets, the old wood groaning under her weight. Her fingers gripped the cold rungs of a maintenance ladder. Whoomp. The wrench struck the metal rung just inches below her foot, the vibration traveling up her leg like an electric shock. "Come down, Maria. Don't make this worse." She climbed faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached the top of the racking system, 20 feet above the concrete floor. Below, Frank's silhouette moved through the shadows, a hunter tracking his prey. She crawled into the narrow, galvanized steel of the ventilation duct, the metal biting into her elbows. She pulled the blueprints and the envelope with her, the paper crinkling in the silence. She crawled until her heart slowed, until the only sound was the wind whistling through the ductwork. She lay there in the dark, the scent of dust and old grease filling her nose. She had the proof. But she was trapped in a dying factory with a man who had nothing left to lose. The silence inside the ventilation shaft was a lie. Beneath the stillness, Maria could hear the factory breathing, the groan of cooling metal, the distant drip of a leaky pipe, and the rhythmic, terrifying clack, clack, clack of Frank's heavy boots on the concrete floor below. She lay flat on her stomach, the cold zinc of the duct pressing against her cheek. Her fingers were cramped, still clutching the envelope that held the death warrant of Motor City parts. She needed to move, but her body felt heavy, anchored by a paralyzing fear she hadn't known since the day her husband walked out and left her with a 5-year-old and a pile of eviction notices. Think, Maria. Think. She checked the small, rugged video recorder clipped to her belt. It was an old model, something she'd bought to document safety violations that Carter always ignored. It was nearly dead, the battery light blinking a weak, taunting red. She'd forgotten to charge it after the double shift. "I know you're up there, Maria." Frank's voice drifted up, distorted by the metal. He sounded calm, almost conversational, which was infinitely worse than shouting. "You're tired. I can hear your breathing. You can't stay in those pipes forever." She ignored him, focused on the blueprints. In the dim light of her phone's screen, she traced the red markings. Frank hadn't just planned to sabotage the machinery. He had mapped out a catastrophic failure of the main transformer. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The government contract. The high-voltage run scheduled for 6 a.m. If the transformer blew during peak load, the resulting fire wouldn't just damage the building, it would incinerate the entire block. And Frank had rigged it to look like her fault. Her login, her codes, her negligence. She scrambled forward, the ductwork booming under her weight. She didn't care about the noise anymore. She had to get to the electrical substation. She reached a junction and kicked out a louvered vent. She dropped down, landing hard on a stack of burlap sacks in the storage annex. The impact jarred her spine, a sharp needle of pain shooting up her back. But she rolled and came up running. She burst into the locker room, her eyes darting to the row of gray metal boxes. She needed a place to hide the evidence. If Frank caught her and found the papers, it was over. Her gaze fell on the Mark IV, a decommissioned lathe from the 1950s that sat in the corner like a rusted monument to a better era. It was a solid hunk of iron, its base hollowed out for a motor that had been scrapped decades ago. She knelt, her fingers fumbling with a loose panel at the back of the machine. She shoved the envelope and the blueprints deep into the dark, oily cavity, then jammed the panel back into place. She grabbed a handful of discarded rags and stuffed them over the gap, masking the entrance. "Maria," the voice was right behind her. She spun around, her back hitting the cold iron of the lathe. Frank was standing in the doorway, the heavy wrench in his hand. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago, his shoulders slumped, his eyes watery in the flickering yellow light of the overhead fluorescents. "Where is it?" he asked softly. "It's over, Frank," she said, her voice shaking but her jaw set. "I've seen the plans. I know what happens at 6 o'clock. Frank sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He stepped into the room, kicking aside a discarded oil can. You don't understand how the world works, Maria. You think being right matters? Apex has the lawyers. They have the city council. They have everyone. I'm just giving them what they want a little sooner. And Jim? Was he what they wanted? Frank flinched. For a second, the mask slipped, and she saw the man who had bought her coffee when she was broke, the man who had defended her against the shop floor bullies. Then the mask hardened again. He was an accident, a variable I didn't account for. He raised the wrench. The papers, Maria. Give them to me, and I'll let you walk out that door. I'll even tell the police I saw someone else at the terminal. I don't believe you. You have to, he said, taking a step closer. Because the only other option is that you don't leave this factory at all. Maria's hand went to her pocket. She felt the recorder. She'd turned it on the moment she heard him enter the room. Tell me how you did it, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. If I'm going to go down for this, I want to know how you framed me. How did you get my codes? Frank laughed, a dry hacking sound. Your password was your daughter's birthday, Maria. You're a good mother, but you're a terrible spy. I watched you type it in a dozen times while I was checking your station. He began to talk, a slow, arrogant confession. He detailed the shantiravani of the fuses, the way he'd bypassed the fire suppression system, the secret meetings with the Apex reps in the back of a dive bar in Dearborn. He spoke with the pride of a craftsman, a man who had spent 40 years building things and was now finding a strange, dark satisfaction in his ability to destroy them. It's genius, really, Frank said, his eyes glazing over with a feverish intensity. The surge will hit the secondary line, bypass the breakers, and ignite the oil sumps in the basement. By the time the fire department gets here, there won't be enough left of Motor City parts to fill a scrap yard. And me? Maria asked, her finger hovering over the stop button on the recorder in her pocket. You'll be the disgruntled employee who tried to sabotage the line to get back at Carter, Frank said, his voice regaining its cold edge. A tragic story. Now, the papers. Maria looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollow shell of the man she had once respected. I don't have them, she said. Frank's face twisted into a snarl. He lunged forward, the wrench swinging in a wide, lethal arc. Maria dived to the side, her shoulders slamming into a metal cabinet. She didn't stop. She scrambled toward the fire alarm on the wall. What are you doing? Frank roared. She grabbed the small metal hammer on its chain and smashed the glass. The sound was a sharp, crystalline explosion. She yanked the lever down. The factory erupted, not with fire, but with sound. The emergency klaxon began to wail, a deafening, rhythmic shriek that tore through the silence. Red strobes began to pulse, turning the locker room into a fragmented nightmare of light and shadow. You bitch! Frank screamed, clutching his ears. Maria didn't wait. She bolted into the corridor, the red light blinding her, the sound vibrating in her very teeth. She ran past the humming transformers, past the silent assembly lines, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. She reached the main bay, just as the headlights of the security patrol swept across the windows. She skidded to a halt, her breath coming in jagged sobs. She looked back and saw Frank emerging from the smoke of the cooling vents, his face a mask of primal rage. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the recorder in her hand. The red light was still blinking. She had him. But as the heavy boots of the security guards thundered toward the door, she realized with a sickening jolt that Frank wasn't running away. He was smoothing his hair. He was straightening his work jacket. He was putting on the mask of the concerned mentor. Over here, Frank shouted to the guards, pointing at Maria. I caught her. She was trying to trip the main breaker. Maria frozen, the recorder heavy in her hand. The guards swarmed through the door, their flashlights blinding her. Drop it, one of them yelled. Hands in the air. Maria looked at Frank. He was smiling, a small, cruel tilt of the lips that only she could see. The trap hadn't just been set. It had just snapped shut. The air in the boardroom was too thin, filtered through an HVAC system that stripped away the honest smell of grease and replaced it with a cloying, artificial scent of mountain spring. Maria sat on the edge of a hard plastic chair, her hands cuffed behind her back, the metal biting into her wrists. Across the polished mahogany table, 5 men in suits that cost more than her annual salary stared at her with the detached curiosity of entomologists pinning a beetle to a board. In the corner, Robert Carter paced, his face a mottled purple. I want her charged with everything, he hissed. Attempted sabotage, trespassing, endangerment. She nearly took out the whole sunrise shift. I didn't do it, Maria said, her voice sounding small and brittle in the cavernous room. Frank did. He's the one who's been talking to Apex. A ripple of laughter went around the table. Frank Walker? One of the directors said, leaning forward. The man who's been with this company for 40 years? The man who caught you red-handed? The door opened, and Frank stepped in. He looked perfect. His work shirt was pressed, his eyes were clear, and he carried a heavy folder of evidence. He didn't look at Maria. He looked at the board with a humble, weary expression that made her want to scream. I'm sorry it had to be her, Frank said, his voice thick with a fake, mournful gravity. I tried to talk her down. I tried to tell her that whatever grievance she had with management wasn't worth the lives of the men on the floor. But she was possessed, gentlemen. He opened the folder and began to lay out the proof. The logs she had seen earlier were there, but they had been altered. Her name was everywhere. The receipts for the bribes were there, but they were tied to an offshore account in her name, an account she didn't even know existed. She was going to blow the transformer at 6, Frank said, pointing to a diagram. I managed to stop her just in time. The lead director turned to Maria. Do you have anything to say for yourself before we call the precinct? Maria looked at Frank. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, a look of smug triumph in his gray eyes. He thought he'd won. He thought the disgruntled mother was an easy mark. I do, Maria said. She looked at the young IT technician sitting in the corner, a kid named Mike who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mike, can you plug this into the system? She nodded toward the small, battered recorder sitting on the table. The security guard had confiscated it, but he hadn't checked the contents. That's just more of her delusions, Frank said, his voice sharpening. Don't waste the board's time. What is it? The director asked. A recording, Maria said, her gaze never leaving Frank's face. From the locker room. Frank likes to talk when he thinks no one is listening. He's very proud of his genius plan. Frank's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. He took a step forward. That's illegal. You can't use that. Actually, the director said, his interest piqued by Frank's sudden panic. I'd like to hear it. Mike? The kid took the recorder and plugged it into the console. A second later, the room was filled with the sounds of the factory, the hum of the machines, the drip of water. And then, Frank's voice. Your password was your daughter's birthday, Maria. I watched you type it in a dozen times while I was checking your station. The room went deathly silent. Frank's voice continued, cold and arrogant, detailing every bribe, every bypass, every planned explosion. He spoke about the Apex reps, about the gambling debts, about how he was going to clear the slate. By the time the fire department gets here, there won't be enough left of Motor City parts to fill a scrapyard. As the recording played, Maria watched Frank. He didn't look like a mentor anymore. He didn't even look like a man. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the door, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a chair. When the recording finished, the silence was absolute. Even Carter had stopped pacing. "Frank?" the director asked, his voice like a guillotine blade. Frank didn't answer. He turned and bolted for the door. He didn't make it. 2 security guards were already there, their hands on their holsters. They tackled him to the ground, the sound of the impact echoing through the room. "Get him out of here," the director said, his face a mask of disgust. "And call the police. Tell them we have a confession." Maria felt the cuffs being unlocked. The weight on her wrists vanished, but the weight on her soul remained. She stood up, her legs trembling. "Maria," the director said, his voice softening. We owe you an apology, and a debt of gratitude. You saved this factory." "I didn't do it for the factory," Maria said, her voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. "I did it for the people who work there, and for my daughter." She walked out of the room, leaving the suits and the mahogany table behind. She walked down the stairs, through the sterile hallways, and out into the morning air. The sun was fully up now, the light reflecting off the rusted steel and broken glass of the Detroit skyline. In the distance, she could hear the roar of the factory beginning its morning shift. The sound was different now. Not a scream, but a steady, rhythmic pulse. She walked toward the parking lot, her limp more pronounced than ever. She saw Jim's mother sitting in a car near the entrance, her face buried in her hands. Maria stopped, wanting to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She got into her car and sat there for a long time, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She felt a strange, hollow victory. The factory was safe. Her job was safe. But the world she had known, the world where Frank was a hero and hard work was enough, was gone. She looked at the colorful string bracelet on her wrist. It was frayed, nearly broken, but it was still there. She turned the key in the ignition. She had to get home. Lisa would be waking up soon, and Maria needed to be there to tell her that everything was going to be okay. Even if she wasn't entirely sure it was true. As she drove away from Motor City Parts, the factory loomed in her rearview mirror, a gray, hulking giant against the blue sky. It was a place of ghosts and machines, of secrets and fire. And Maria Jensen, the woman who had saved it, was finally going home. The road ahead was cracked and worn, but for the first time in years, the horizon looked a little bit brighter. The end,